Eusebius of Caesarea, also known as Eusebius Pamphili, was a Roman historian, exegete, and Christian polemicist of Greek descent. He became the bishop of Caesarea Maritima about 314. Together with Pamphilus, he was a scholar of the biblical canon and is regarded as an extremely well-learned Christian of his time. He wrote demonstrations of the gospel, preparations for the gospel, and on discrepancies between the gospels, studies of the biblical text. As father of church history, he produced the Ecclesiastical History, on the life of Pamphilus, the Chronicle, and on the martyrs' early life. In his Ecclesiastical History, Eusebius writes of Dionysius of Alexandria as his contemporary. If this is true, Eusebius's birth must have been before Dionysius's death in autumn 264. Most modern scholars date the birth to some point in the 5 years between 260 and 265. He was presumably born in the town in which he lived for most of his adult life, Caesarea Maritima. He was baptized and instructed in the city, and lived in Palestine in 296, when Diocletian's army passed through the region. Eusebius was made presbyter by Eusebius of Caesarea. Some, like theologian and ecclesiastical historian John Henry Newman, understand Eusebius's statement that he had heard Dorotheus of Tyre expound the scriptures wisely in the church to indicate that Eusebius was Dorotheus's pupil while the priest was resident in Antioch. Others, like the scholar D.S. Wallace Hadrill, deem the phrase too ambiguous to support the contention. By the 3rd century, Caesarea had a population of about 100,000. It had been a pagan city since Pompey had given control of the city to the Gentiles during his command of the eastern provinces in the 60s BC. The Gentiles retained control of the city for the 3 centuries to follow, despite Jewish petitions for joint governorship. Gentile government was strengthened by the city's refoundation under Herod the Great, when it had taken on the name of Augustus Caesar. In addition to the Gentile settlers, Caesarea had large Jewish and Samaritan minorities. Eusebius was probably born into the Christian contingent of the city. Caesarea's Christian community presumably had a history reaching back to apostolic times, but it is a common claim that no bishops are attested for the town before about 190, even though the Apostolic Constitution 7.46 states that Sakia was the first bishop. Through the activities of the theologian Origen and the school of his follower Pamphilus, Caesarea became a center of Christian learning. Origen was largely responsible for the collection of usage information, or which churches were using which Gospels, regarding the texts which became the New Testament. The information used to create the late 4th century Easter letter, which declared accepted Christian writings, was probably based on the Ecclesiastical History of Eusebius of Caesarea, wherein he uses the information passed on to him by Origen to create both his list at E325 and Origen's list at E625. Eusebius got his information about what texts were accepted by the 3rd century churches throughout the known world, a great deal of which Origen knew of first-hand from his extensive travels. From the library and writings of Origen. On his deathbed, Origen had made a bequest of his private library to the Christian community in the city. Together with the books of his patron Ambrosius, Origen's library formed the core of the collection that Pamphilus established. Pamphilus also managed a school that was similar to that of Origen. Pamphilus was compared to Demetrius of Phalerum and Pisistratus, for he had gathered Bibles from all parts of the world. Like his model Origen, Pamphilus maintained close contact with his students. Eusebius, in his History of the Persecutions, alludes to the fact that many of the Caesarean martyrs lived together, presumably under Pamphilus. Soon after Pamphilus settled in Caesarea, he began teaching Eusebius, who was then somewhere between 20 and 25. Because of his close relationship with his schoolmaster, Eusebius was sometimes called Eusebius Pamphili, Eusebius, son of Pamphilus. The name may also indicate that Eusebius was made Pamphilus's heir. Pamphilus gave Eusebius a strong admiration for the thought of Origen. Neither Pamphilus nor Eusebius knew Origen personally. Pamphilus probably picked up Origenist ideas during his studies under Pierius in Alexandria. In Caesarea, Origenist thought was continued in the generation after his death by Theotegnus, bishop of the city for much of the late 3rd century and an alumnus of Origen's school. Eusebius's preparation for the Gospel bears witness to the literary tastes of Origen. Eusebius quotes no comedy, tragedy, or lyric poetry, but makes reference to all the works of Plato and to an extensive range of later philosophic works, largely from Middle Platonists from Philo to the late 2nd century. Whatever its secular contents, the primary aim of Origen and Pamphilus' school was to promote sacred learning. The library's biblical and theological contents were more impressive. Origen's hexapla and tetrapla, a copy of the original Aramaic version of the Gospel of Matthew, are many of Origen's own writings. Marginal comments in extant manuscripts note that Pamphilus and his friends and pupils, including Eusebius, corrected and revised much of the biblical text in the library. Their efforts made the hexaplaric Septuagint text increasingly popular in Syria and Palestine. Soon after joining Pamphilus's school, Eusebius started helping his master expand the library's collections and broaden access to its resources. At about this time, Eusebius compiled a collection of ancient martyrdoms, presumably for use as a general reference tool. In the 290s, Eusebius began work on his magnum opus, the Ecclesiastical History, a narrative history of the Church and Christian community from the Apostolic Age to Eusebius's own time. At about the same time, he worked on his Chronicle, a universal calendar of events from the creation to, again, Eusebius's own time. He completed the first editions of the Ecclesiastical History and Chronicle before 300. Bishop of Caesarea. Eusebius succeeded Agapius as Bishop of Caesarea soon after 313 and was called on by Arius, who had been excommunicated by his bishop Alexander of Alexandria. An episcopal council in Caesarea pronounced Arius blameless. Eusebius, a learned man and famous author, enjoyed the favor of the Emperor Constantine. Because of this, he was called upon to present the creed of his own church to the 318 attendees of the Council of Nicaea in 325. However, the anti-Arian creed from Palestine prevailed, becoming the basis for the Nicene Creed. The theological views of Arius that taught the subordination of the Son to the Father continued to be a problem. Eustathius of Antioch strongly opposed the growing influence of Origen's theology as the root of Arianism. Eusebius, an admirer of Origen, was reproached by Eustathius for deviating from the Nicene faith. Eusebius prevailed and Eustathius was deposed at a synod in Antioch. However, Athanasius of Alexandria became a more powerful opponent, and in 334, he was summoned before a synod in Caesarea. In the following year, he was again summoned before a synod in Tyre, at which Eusebius of Caesarea presided. Athanasius, foreseeing the result, went to Constantinople to bring his cause before the emperor. Constantine called the bishops to his court, among them Eusebius. Athanasius was condemned and exiled at the end of 335. Eusebius remained in the emperor's favor throughout this time and more than once was exonerated with the explicit approval of the emperor Constantine. After the emperor's death, Eusebius wrote the Life of Constantine, an important historical work because of eyewitness accounts and the use of primary sources. Eusebius died c. 339. Death. Much like his birth, the exact date of Eusebius's death is unknown. However, there is primary text evidence from a council held in Antioch that by the year 341, his successor Acacius had already filled the seat as bishop. Socrates and Cicerone write about Eusebius's death, and place it just before Constantine's son died, which was in early 340. They also say that it was after the second banishment of Athanasius, which began in mid-339. This means that his death occurred sometime between the second half of 339 and early 340. Works of the extensive literary activity of Eusebius, a relatively large portion has been preserved. Although posterity suspected him of Arianism, Eusebius had made himself indispensable by his method of authorship. His comprehensive and careful excerpts from original source saved his success is the painstaking labor of original research. Hence, much has been preserved, quoted by Eusebius, which otherwise would have been destroyed. The literary productions of Eusebius reflect on the whole the course of his life. At first, he occupied himself with works on biblical criticism under the influence of Pamphilus and probably of Dorotheus of Tyre of the school of Antioch. Afterward, the persecutions under Diocletian and Galerius directed his attention to the martyrs of his own time and the past, and this led him to the history of the whole church and finally to the history of the world, which to him was only a preparation for ecclesiastical history. Then followed the time of the Arian controversies, and dogmatic questions came into the foreground. Christianity at last found recognition by the state, and this brought new problems. Apologies of a different sort had to be prepared. Lastly, Eusebius wrote eulogies in praise of Constantine. To all this activity must be added numerous writings of a miscellaneous nature, addresses, letters, and the like, and exegetical works that extended over the whole of his life and that include both commentaries and treatises on biblical archaeology. Onomasticon. Eusebius's Onomasticon is a work that moderns would recognize as a gazetteer, a directory of place names, but which ancients had no category for. It sits uneasily between the ancient genres of geography and lexicography, taking elements from both but a member of neither. Eusebius's description of his own method: I shall collect the entries from the whole of the divinely inspired scriptures, and I shall set them out grouped by their initial letters so that one may easily perceive what lies scattered throughout the text, implies that he had no similar type of book to work from. His work was entirely original, based only on the text of the Bible. As he describes, Eusebius organizes his entries into separate categories according to the first letters. Under each letter, the entries are organized first by the book they are found in, and then by the place in that book. The entries for Joshua under Tau, for example, read as follows: Tina, of the tribe of Judah; Telem, of the tribe of Judah; Tesam, of the tribe of Judah; Tyre, of the tribe of Naphtali. Where there is a contemporary town at the site or nearby, Eusebius notes it in the corresponding entry. Terebinth, for example, describes Shechem as near Neapolis, modern Nablus, and Tophet is located in the suburbs of Jerusalem. The Onomasticon has traditionally been dated before 324, on the basis of its sparse references to Christianity, and complete absence of remarks on Constantine's buildings in the Holy Land. The work also describes traditional religious practices at the Oak of Mamre as though they were still happening, while they are known to have been suppressed soon after 325, when a church was built on the site. Eusebius references to the encampment of the Legio Ten Fratensis at Isla. The Ex Fratensis was probably transferred from Jerusalem to Isla under Diocletian. Biblical texts criticism. Pamphilus and Eusebius occupied themselves with the textual criticism of the Septuagint text of the Old Testament and especially of the New Testament. An edition of the Septuagint seems to have been already prepared by Origen, which, according to Jerome, was revised and circulated by Eusebius and Pamphilus. For an easier survey of the material of the four evangelists, Eusebius divided his edition of the New Testament into paragraphs and provided it with the synoptical tables so that it might be easier to find the pericopes that belong together. These canon tables, or Eusebian canons, remained in use throughout the Middle Ages, and illuminated manuscript versions are important for the study of early medieval art, as they are the most elaborately decorated pages of many gospel books. Eusebius detailed in Epistula ad Carpanum how to use his canons. The chronicle is divided into two parts. The first part, the chronography, gives an epitome of universal history from the sources arranged according to nations. The second part, the canons, furnishes a synchronism of the historical material in parallel columns, the equivalent of a parallel timeline. The work as a whole has been lost in the original Greek, but it may be reconstructed from later chronographists of the Byzantine school who made excerpts from the work, especially George Syncellus. The tables of the second part have been completely preserved in a Latin translation by Jerome, and both parts are still extant in an Armenian translation. The loss of the Greek originals has given an Armenian translation a special importance. Thus, the first part of Eusebius's chronicle, of which only a few fragments exist in the Greek, has been preserved entirely in Armenian, though with lacunae. The chronicle as preserved extends to the year 325. Church history. In his church history or ecclesiastical history, Eusebius wrote the first surviving history of the Christian Church as a chronologically ordered account, based on earlier sources, complete from the period of the Apostles to his own epoch. The time scheme correlated the history with the reigns of the Roman emperors, and the scope was broad. Included were the bishops and other teachers of the Church, Christian relations with the Jews and those deemed heretical, and the Christian martyrs through 324. Although its accuracy and biases have been questioned, it remains an important source on the early Church due to Eusebius's access to materials now lost. Life of Constantine. Eusebius's Life of Constantine is a eulogy, a panegyric, and therefore its style and selection of facts are affected by its purpose, rendering it inadequate as a continuation of the church history. Is the historian Socrates Scholasticus said, at the opening of his history, which was designed as a continuation of Eusebius. Also in writing the Life of Constantine, this same author has but slightly treated of matters regarding Arius, being more intent on the rhetorical finish of his composition and the praises of the emperor than on an accurate statement of facts. The work was unfinished at Eusebius's death. Some scholars have questioned the Eusebian authorship of this work. Minor historical works. Before he compiled his church history, Eusebius edited a collection of martyrdoms of the earlier period and a biography of Pamphilus. The martyrology has not survived as a whole, but it has been preserved almost completely in parts. It contained an epistle of the congregation of Smyrna concerning the martyrdom of Polycarp, the martyrdom of Pionius, the martyrdoms of Carpus, Papilus, and Agathonic, the martyrdoms in the congregations of Vienne and Lyon, the martyrdom of Apollonius. Of the life of Pamphilus, only a fragment survives. A work on the Martyrs of Palestine in the time of Diocletian was composed after 311. Numerous fragments are scattered in legendaries which have yet to be collected. The life of Constantine was compiled after the death of the emperor and the election of his sons as Augusti. It is more a rhetorical eulogy on the emperor than a history, but is of great value on account of numerous documents incorporated in it. Apologetic and dogmatic works. To the class of apologetic and dogmatic works belong the Apology for Origen, the first 5 books of which, according to the definite statement of Photius, were written by Pamphilus in prison, with the assistance of Eusebius. Eusebius added the 6th book after the death of Pamphilus. We possess only a Latin translation of the first book, made by Rufinus, a treatise against Hierocles, in which Eusebius combated the former's glorification of Apollonius of Tyana in a work entitled A Truth-Loving Discourse, in spite of manuscript attribution to Eusebius. However, it has been argued that this treatise against Hierocles was written by someone other than Eusebius of Caesarea. Preparatio Evangelica, commonly known by its Latin title, which attempts to prove the excellence of Christianity over every pagan religion and philosophy. The Preparatio consists of 15 books which have been completely preserved. Eusebius considered it an introduction to Christianity for pagans, but its value for many later readers is more because Eusebius studied this work with so many lively fragments from historians and philosophers which are nowhere else preserved. Here alone is preserved a summary of the writings of the Phoenician priest Sanchoniathon, of which the accuracy has been shown by the mythological accounts found on the Ugaritic tables. Here alone is the account from Diodorus Siculus' 6th book of Euhemerus's wondrous voyage to the island of Panchaea, where Euhemerus purports to have found his true history of the gods. And here almost alone is preserved writings of the Neoplatonist philosopher Atticus, along with so much else. Demonstratio Evangelica is closely connected to the Preparatio and comprised originally 20 books, of which 10 have been completely preserved, as well as a fragment of the 15th. Here Eusebius treats of the person of Jesus Christ. The work was probably finished before 311. Another work which originated in the time of the persecution, entitled Prophetic Extracts. It discusses in 4 books the messianic texts of Scripture. The work is merely the surviving portion of the general elementary introduction to the Christian faith, now lost. The fragments given as the commentary on Luke in the PG have been claimed to derive from the missing 10th book of the general elementary introduction. C.D.S. Wallace Hadrill. However, Aaron Johnson has argued that they cannot be associated with this work. The treatise on divine manifestation, or on the Theophania, of unknown date. It treats of the incarnation of the divine Logos, and its contents are in many cases identical with the Demonstratio Evangelica. Only fragments are preserved in Greek, but a complete Syriac translation of the Theophania survives in an early 5th century manuscript. Samuel Lee, the editor and translator of the Syriac Theophania, thought that the work must have been written after the general peace restored to the Church by Constantine, and before either the Preparatio or the Demonstratio Evangelica was written. It appears probable, therefore, that this was one of the first productions of Eusebius, if not the first after the persecutions ceased. Hugo Gressman, noting in 1904 that the Demonstratio seems to be mentioned at IV 37 and V1, and that 2:14 seems to mention the extant practice of temple prostitution at Hierapolis in Phoenicia, concluded that the Theophania was probably written shortly after 324. Others have suggested a date as late as 337, a polemical treatise against Marcellus of Ancera, the Against Marcellus, dating from about 337, a supplement to the last-named work, also against Marcellus, entitled Ecclesiastical Theology, in which he defended the Nicene doctrine of the Logos against the party of Athanasius. A number of writings belonging in this category have been entirely lost. Exegetical and miscellaneous works. All of the exegetical works of Eusebius have suffered damage in transmission. The majority of them are known to us only from long portions quoted in Byzantine Catena commentaries. However, these portions are very extensive. Extant are an enormous commentary on the Psalms, a commentary on Isaiah, discovered more or less complete in a manuscript in Florence early in the 20th century and published 50 years later. Small fragments of commentaries on Romans and 1 Corinthians. Eusebius also wrote a work Questions ad Stephanum Marinum on the differences of the Gospels. This was written for the purpose of harmonizing the contradictions in the reports of the different evangelists. This work was recently translated into the English language by David J. Miller and Adam C. McCollum and was published under the name Eusebius of Caesarea, Gospel Problems and Solutions. The original work was also translated into Syriac, and lengthy quotations exist in a Catena in that language, and also in Coptic and Arabic Catanese. Eusebius also wrote treatises on biblical archaeology, a work on the Greek equivalents of Hebrew gentilic nouns, a description of Old Judea with an account of the loss of the 10 tribes, a plan of Jerusalem and a Temple of Solomon. These 3 treatises have been lost. The addresses and sermons of Eusebius are mostly lost, but some have been preserved, e.g., a sermon on the consecration of the Church in Tyre and an address on the 30th anniversary of the reign of Constantine. Most of Eusebius's letters are lost. His letters to Carpinus and Flacillus exist complete. Fragments of a letter to the Empress Constantia also exists.